Hello, my name is Prince David, and I'm the country director for Tier Fund in India. Today, I'm going to talk about prevention and share with you a couple of strategies, prevention strategies that we have followed and found a decrease in the number of human trafficking cases. Let me first begin with why prevention. There's such a lot of emphasis on rescue, rehabilitation, prosecution. Prevention is very low cost. It's low in investment, but very huge in impact in terms of its reach as well. It's very rapid. And once communities learn how to prevent trafficking, it becomes viral and it spreads from one community to another to another. Results are very quick. You can see the impact almost within 6 months in smaller communities, and in some cases it can take up to 12 to 18 months. Prevention actually addresses root causes of poverty, root causes or reasons why people in the first place are trafficked. Low in technology because it integrates with where people are and uses their environment and does not require huge amounts of technology. The reach is high, as I said. It can reach a large number of people, large populations across territories and even across country boundaries. It's replicable and therefore very easy to replicate. It integrates very well with community development and humanitarian response. It's sustainable in its approach and relatively low risk because communities lead it. So what are some of the key factors that lead to trafficking? And that's something very important to understand and address as we go along in adopting strategies for prevention. The first one is people have low income. And usually in source areas, some people do not have a source of income. In fact, they are dependent on work that they do and the food grain that is given to them. There are limited economic opportunities because they are limited in skills, and sometimes they are landless, particularly if they are in agriculture communities. And sometimes there isn't anything around. The areas are underdeveloped. And therefore their livelihoods are also limited. There's high rate of illiteracy and risk awareness is very low. People are very trusting. If a promise is shown to them or made to them, they're quite vulnerable and they're quite easy to follow that. Also, there's low socioeconomic strata. And this is a very key contributing factor in communities where there are divisions by caste or class, and there are social norms that are accepted. So if a person is born in a particular family, it's a social norm. It's accepted that they are born there, and this is how life operates, that they are kept there. Also, women and girls are deserted or they are abandoned by their husbands or families. This is quite a common cultural practice in Asia. Abuse and violence, sexual gender-based violence is something which is hidden, not always visible. But this has been a huge cause in trafficking instances, particularly amongst girls and younger women. And then there are these disadvantaged or excluded communities because of the way they are categorized. They are underserviced, they are not included in the mainstream of life, and for generations together, they continue to be where they are and therefore are very vulnerable. Then let's look at other critical factors that contribute towards trafficking in source areas. For instance, law enforcement is very weak or completely non-existent. There's negligence sometimes, and quite often, because of negligence, traffickers go scot-free. Then one of the learnings that I've seen in cases or instances of trafficking is where communities that are poor and there are people with disability within the family, particularly the main breadwinner, that impacts, that reduces their ability to earn. And sometimes people with disability, depending on where they are on the spectrum, are also trafficked. Then we look at the factors of weak or poor local self-governance. Certain communities do not really have a robust local self-governance. They are organized communities, they have a culture of their own, they gather together and they have their own courts. But self-governance is weak in this area of recognizing the problem. Other vulnerability factors which we will look at are shocks, sudden shocks like earthquakes, unannounced floods, sudden armed violence, conflict in the area which nobody knew was on the way and it's there. Then there are stresses like climate change, chronic malnutrition in a population because of their feeding habits or because they sell all the vegetables and do not give those to their children. HIV, for instance. These are all slow onset problems or stresses. Then there's uncertainty. Now we have a classic example of COVID-19, who in any of our communities in source areas, particularly in rural areas, had ever imagined that COVID-19, or in fact, for that matter, even in the urban part of the world, who had imagined COVID-19 would have such an foreseeable a change, and therefore uncertainties, and then resulting in lockdowns and others. So vulnerability factors that I explained are shocks, and they reduce the sense of well-being in a community. And in the axis that we have seen over here, over time, people's well-being goes down. And once that happens, whether it's a shock or a stress or uncertainty, the sense of well-being goes down, and that makes people hopeless. When I say vulnerability factors and over time their well-being, a sense of well-being can easily be equated with a sense of losing hope within where they are, and therefore they're open to any opportunity that will take them out to where a good promise is made to them. So here's the first prevention strategy that I'm going to share with you, and that is build community resilience. There's absolutely no substitute to building community resilience, because communities are places where people are safe and they are protected if all that the community has is awareness and good governance. Let me explain that. So let's understand resilience. Now, in the development world and in the humanitarian aid world or sectors, resilience does not really have a clear definition or description, but it's an generally agreed as an accepted term, resilience. So what is resilience? And what does resilience do really is a question. So resilience actually is the ability to deal with, as I explained earlier, shocks, stresses, and uncertainties. Resilient communities will have a better ability to deal with shocks, to deal with stresses which are slow set in, and sudden uncertainties. They will have a backup plan. They will be able to spring back, or at least have some capacity. Then they also have the ability to deal, or as I said earlier, absorb. They can recover. The recovery may be slow. In some cases where assets have been created, then economic recovery can be a little faster. And if they have risk transfer opportunities, then in in that case, they have something to fall back on. They can adapt, which is again an amazing capability of the human species, adaptability, especially when we look at climate change and how communities over time have started adapting to that. And of course, they hold a core capabilities and their identity. All of these amount together for resilience. Let me go back and say resilience is equal to flourishing. If invested in resilience, communities will flourish. So let's start thinking resilience. Let's look at not just the 1 and 2 people who we know have been trafficked. Yes, it's important to provide resources or provide support to those who have returned, but it's important to think in terms of resilience. And that is where the humanitarian aid or emergency response and the development sector of water, sanitation, and all that need to work together. Look at livelihoods, for instance. Instead of just thinking risk reduction in one area, start integrating risk reduction in good development. Start thinking of adaptation, because communities cannot in their own capacity change the climate change impact that they are noticing, erratic rainfall or droughts in the monsoon or rainy season, and rain in other seasons where they are not quite prepared for it. So adaptation, using adaptation methods, using different kind of seed that can probably last in a drought season longer. And then think conflict resolution, peace building, food security, and natural resource management. These are very simple, but when we apply them, of course, they can become a little complex, but these are very simple, logical solutions to preventing human trafficking. If there is peace, and there is peace building that's been going on in a community, then obviously conflict is reduced and communities can work together. Where they have worked on their agriculture, there is a strong likelihood that there will be food secure communities. They will have food banks. So in the event of a natural disaster, they know what to do and where to go to for food banks or grain banks, as in rural communities. And of course, their natural resource management. So thinking resilience means we build resilience. And how does that really happen? And as I said, in communities that are both flood prone and drought prone, and in some cases frequently flooding and frequently experiencing drought in the rainy season, there's a transition or there's a journey from risk to resilience. Much of our development activity has focused in the past in trying to reduce the risk, but it's time to journey towards thinking at resilience. Do a problem mapping. Don't just look at solutions of addressing an immediate problem, but look at what are long-term solutions to that. Do vulnerability assessments of communities. What makes the communities vulnerable? And I've earlier talked about that in a previous slide. How do we build the capacity or the coping mechanism in the community? Quite often the coping mechanisms exist in the community. All that needs to be done is to help strengthen those. Communities have been there from before our programs came in, and sometimes it's good to go to the older generation and ask them. And then talk about adaptation plans and a way forward. So what are elements of community resilience? So these are things that we build in our strategy to reduce trafficking, to see zero trafficking in communities from one to the other, and all along, some of these factors played a very critical role. First is to build community awareness and mobilize the community. Quite often, communities do not know the end result because people who have been trafficked sometimes don't return back, and particularly in the case of children. I have found that bringing in children who were trafficked and have survived and escaped and returned back, asking them to tell their stories to the community has a huge impact. And sometimes even adults, when they tell their horrifying experiences, communities learn from that. So awareness and mobilization. Formation of vigilance groups. Again, this is such an important group. Communities can organize themselves, people can select vigilant individuals and form groups who will make sure who is entering into the village and will have a registry, and will make sure who is leaving the village and have a registry, so that they can be contacted in the event of a person missing. Quite a lot of communities in India and villages have self-help groups because of the training or the development community that has brought in, and they are usually savings groups. Now, if in these there is discussion around trafficking, people will understand, and also have producer groups that have elements or understanding of trafficking. Safe migration. A lot of people migrate. Quite often it's a migration of choice because it's the season when they are not sowing and they can go out. And in other cases, it could be distress migration. But if there is adequate information, where to go, how to go, what are the employment opportunities, they will be safe. Increased sources of livelihoods right there where they are. Improved security as a result of agriculture. Access to health care is again an important element where people will become resilient, or communities will. And then manage self-development. And I think that is a responsibility that is demonstrated in a maturity model when community development is done, where communities start taking responsibility for their own development and are no longer dependent. And they have a robust self-governance, and then they are able to advocate for their own rights. Advocacy, of course, initially begins perhaps from an external source, but then this can begin to happen internally, and that is where we see a sign of maturity in a community. Resilience can also be measured when we see that communities are participating, individuals are participating, they are influencing themselves and other communities. There are strong social connects. Well, traffickers use the social disconnect quite often and pry upon their victims. Personal relationships become stronger, and these can be measured. There's greater confidence. There's faith. There's emotional and mental health that becomes strong, and communities are less in stress. Physical health is a good measure. When people are eating well, they have good physical health as well. Children particularly, women as well. There's stewardship of their environment and material assets and resources. And of course, you can see capabilities as well. So, building resilient communities is the first strategy. The second strategy is to mobilize and equip faith-based communities and affinity groups. Right across Asia, we find that there are faith-based communities, and these communities form themselves in very strong, cohesive groups. And it is found quite useful to envision them, to inspire them, because each faith-based group has an ideology which talks about community. And so the aim should be to envision and equip groups, these faith-based groups, to engage in prevention so that they challenge trafficking. And then by exploring their ideology, which is reflecting on their ideology or theology, they commit to action. And this has really worked well in several cases that we have found across in South Asia. So the key question to reflect with faith-based communities is, why should faith groups respond, in particular with the community that we are working with? Why should their faith group respond? And often leaders will come up with the answers themselves if they start reflecting on the value their faith places on humanity. There are immediate results we have seen in the case of Nepal, where a lot of our work has been with different faith-based communities, and they form support groups for survivors and for vulnerable girls and women. They form information centers for migrant workers, especially as there is a culture of migration from rural parts of Nepal to urban and even going abroad. Networks and links are formed so that movements can be tracked across country and across the borders. And then they form faith-based communities, and affinity communities also have different levels. They are formed at the district level, they can form themselves at the state level, and even higher. And then there are interest groups that can replicate the method because it's very simple and it's based on information. Again, no technology required. Immediate impact can be seen once these communities work. And let me show you a quick graph here, an organogram picture of the flow. So if a reflection, and this is from experience when we did a reflection with a particular faith-based group at a regional level, very soon it was quite easy to access the same discussion and leaders at the district level. It kind of formed a conference and people came for 2-3 days, and the focus there was on reflection. Why as a faith-based group? What is our faith telling us to do? Whether be it a local community based in a very, very remote part. When they think, then action is automatically conceived. We've done this in 3 districts already, and we've seen a huge impact. And the national trafficking in persons report in 2018 showed these 3 districts as the top districts from where people were moving. So a very simple cascading structure which filters right down to the community and grassroots, because faith-based communities are organized that way as well. So we start at the national level, go to the district level, and then further down. And just in one attempt, over a period of about 12 months, or maybe a little bit more than 12 months, there were about 152 groups that were trained. And when I'm talking about groups, they're all geographically spread in these 3 districts. There are about 295 plus participants who were trained. They were equipped to deal with the problem at their level. And 120 leaders. When I say 120 community leaders, these are leaders who are leading other leaders as well. Some of the immediate actions that these groups will take are very simple, and these bring about a lot of change. Now, after the first conference that we had, we found that suddenly 3 girls had disappeared from one community, from where one of the leaders had come. The leader was able to go back and quickly make contact with others, which means their connections, those who came and participated in the conference, or with those who acted as resource persons, and an agency was contacted. The immediate result was 3 girls were rescued. Now here's an informed leader who attends a conference and who knows what to do as a part of his action. So rescue happened. Of course, they found counseling on safe migration. They realized that some of their own community, their own people from their own faith were being trafficked, and so they can work and create counseling and safe migration centers. Employment for adolescent girls as well, risk of understanding what is there, what is lurking outside their community. Teaching and preaching about human trafficking, because quite often faith communities have the platform, they have a ready platform to address this from where they stand and it does not require them to gather people on a subject. They already have a ready audience and people are willing to listen. And the importance they give to faith leaders is when something is said, people listen to that very intently. And then the discussion goes on in families and then in community, and then that impacts the whole nation as well. So these are two simple, low investment, but high impact strategies. We have not measured, we haven't reached the level of measurement yet because the investment is continuing, but the immediate results are very clear that trafficking is being prevented. Communities are keeping themselves safe. Building resilient communities and envisioning faith leaders are two strategies that I propose here for people to try. Thank you very much for your time.